How many of you voted for Donald Trump? How many of you voted for him because you wanted him to take us to war with Iran? Well, regardless, that seems to be what is happening. If you're paying attention, you probably already noticed that there's a massive armada being built up in the Middle East. They just sent Gerald Ford, the largest and scariest aircraft carrier strike group that we have. The Lincoln was already there, it was sent 2 or 3 weeks ago. And meanwhile, they're pretending to be in the middle of negotiations. It's hard to tell, but my suspicion, as is so many others, is that the negotiations are more of a facade, perhaps um, to make people feel like they're actually giving it the good old college try in fostering peace and hitting a negotiations. But there are elements of this negotiation that if I were Iran, I wouldn't really take them either. And so we're at this point where the American people, of course, for the most part, I believe they're still most people believe that we're kind of in the right in this because it's hard to accept that Iran, it's a theocracy. The people there are, suicidal Muslims or whatever. That's what they tell us. And I'm sure there's an element of truth to this. I know there's an element of truth to the tyranny and the oppression that has existed there. And I'm not dismissing any of that, but that kind of stuff is everywhere. It exists in more than just Iran. And we have to face the fact that most likely, I guess it's not a fact, but it's a most likely a fact that this isn't really about the oppression of the Iranian people. Again, there's lots of people being oppressed, including in China, where they have the Uyghurs, where they basically have them in surveillance villages and whatnot. There's other countries in Asia, including again North Korea. I mean, that you want to talk about oppression. That's one place where people are really, really held down into the mud with the boot of the government right on their neck. So I don't believe that's what this is about. My belief is that I share that with a belief with lots of people, and that this is really about. Um, it could be about oil, and it could also be about Israel, of course. Israel has been egging us to attack Iran, and they've been telling us that Iran's going to develop a nuclear weapon for like decades. And I'm not saying that they haven't. They seem to, at some point, enriched beyond civilian use. And I know that our intelligence community said that that they don't have any evidence that they're building one, but they did acknowledge that at 60% purity or whatnot, that's far beyond civilian use. So there's a lot of facts, there's a lot of nuance here, and I'm not going to pretend that there isn't. But I think if we were to look at the whole thing, and if we were to look at it objectively, I think most people, most sensible people, if not all sensible people, would say that we probably shouldn't be doing this. It's not our place, really. And I think it goes contrary to the values of the founding fathers and the founding generations, whose foreign policy prescription was basically let's try to live at peace with everybody. Let's try, we can have commerce with them and whatnot, but let's really not get entangled here. And, no entangling alliances. That was something they liked to emphasize. I think it's clear to say that we have an entangling alliance with Israel in the Middle East. We have entangling alliances with the Western Europeans in Europe. Um, not as strong as they used to be and whatnot, which is actually a good thing. But we have something happening here, and I think if we were to take a close look, or if we were to take an objective look, we would not be okay with this. And I think the best way to look at this is, what if we were on the other side, or let's look at it from their point of view. So what are the thing, sometimes I'll hear from people who've been in the military, who've served in various operations over there, whether it be in Iraq or Afghanistan and whatnot. And I have a lot of respect for people who've been in the military. I have, siblings. I have a brother who did tours, uh, 2 tours, I believe. He came away with some damage and whatnot, and so I get it. I have a stepson who's in the National Guard. I have, my father-in-law, he was in Vietnam, and it was like pretty hardcore. So I have a massive amount of respect for our veterans. Now, with that being said, I don't always necessarily agree with their stance, which tends to be in support of what is happening. And I don't think it's because they're bad people. I certainly, I think they're actually very good people. I don't remember ever running across veterans that I didn't like. But I think there is a tendency as a veteran, as somebody maybe who is in the military, um, to believe to believe kind of what they were told because they would have to, right? To go in there and partake in a mission or to tell, Operation Freedom and whatever. And so that's part of the game. That's how they sell this. And so what all that I'm saying, it's like I haven't heard any convincing arguments from people who have been there that it's a good idea for us to be there. My position, my developing position is that we should not be in the Middle East, like at all, at all. Now, when you start to take the Western Hemisphere into consideration and whatnot, I think that gets a little dicier. But let's leave that out of the picture for this conversation. Let's just focus across the planet, across the globe, where right now we have 30, I think 30% of the Air Force. We have a massive amount of buildup, and it looks like the reason is to go to war with Iran or whatnot, to hit them and and strike them because apparently they're building a. The main reason is because they just won't halt their nuclear enrichment. But you know what's weird about that? Because it was about a half a year ago, barely a little over a half a year ago, when the president of the United States told us that they had set that program back decades. And when a report came out saying that that may not be the case, they, they got all in a huff and they said that some low level intel agent leaked that report out and whatnot, and they rebuked it and they huffed and puffed and got all angry. But now, like 6, 7 months later, we're at the same point. This is craziness, people. This is absolute craziness. You have to realize that they're playing us. They're always playing us. Now, one of two things could be happening. They could be, evil geniuses who, say what they need to say at the moment, and then they'll move on and, they'll make up for it later, and they'll say whatever they need to say when the time comes again to do whatever it is that they want, regardless of the fact that, they had said something about that previous item totally different, right? It could also be that they're incompetent. They're very incompetent. And when it comes to Trump, I know a lot of people, think that he's smarter than he is. And I used to as well. And I used to think that there's a genius there. And I still do believe there's a genius there. I just don't think it's as prevalent as I used to believe or others believe. I think the man is, I think he's kind of dumb. When it comes to foreign policy, I think he's dumb. I think he's also prone to being influenced because everybody in the world knows that the way to influence Donald Trump is to basically flatter him and whisper sweet nothings into his ear. This seems to be what I've observed, and it seems to work. And that's what people do. They tell him what they want to hear. Now, everyone has heard him say several times about how, "Oh, I like him." And they'll be like, "Well, why?" "Well, he likes me." And it's like, "Well, what kind of answer is that?" That's not a very mature answer. It's certainly not a answer you want to hear from from the man who has apparently who has unilateral power to sic the most powerful military that has ever existed in the history of mankind on anyone he wishes. That's the guy doing it. Okay. This is crazy. We are living in crazy land. And sometimes I'm just glad and surprised that all of this is still standing. I don't it just the amount of craziness and ignorance and insanity that prevails amongst the people in charge is out of this world, out of this world insane. And the fact that we continue to allow unilateral decisions by the president for war and things like that. The fact that we are not up in arms and looking into basically firing half of Congress, impeaching the president. Yes, I would go so far as to say it's time to probably time to impeach him. Okay, and the reason for that is because first of all there's serious allegations in the Epstein files that implicate him. So maybe we should at least question him. Okay, and impeachment. I don't know if there's any legal basis. I can't think of any. I would just say impeach him because he's basically breaking his promises. This was one of the biggest promises that he made, no new wars. He ran on a platform of ceasing the forever wars and no new wars. He told us, he bragged about it, how that was the case during his first term, which was more or less the case. And this was a major, major, major campaign promise. And this was a major appeal for lots of voters, including lots of independent voters who came to the Republicans. Okay, they did really good. He did really good. He swept all the swing states. He defeated the mainstream machine and whatnot. It was glorious. It was absolutely glorious. People came on board from everywhere. The tech gurus and all these people went to work. Charlie Kirk, mobilized his little election protection army all over the place. It was wonderful. We had great hope. We saw this man, survive an assassinate two assassination attempts, I guess, at least one very televised one, and things like that. We thought this was like, it was meant to be. And then this guy gets in office, and he does he does a 180. He does a 180. All of a sudden, we're bombing Iran. We're busting into Venezuela, nabbing their corrupt communist head of state, taking over their government. Now we're threatening to go to war with Iran again. We're still in Eastern Europe. We're still providing intel. We're selling Europe weapons to keep that war going. None of this makes sense. We're threatening to take Greenland by force, which seems to have died out a little bit now because the Europeans are like, no, you're not. This is getting ridiculous. Okay. This is not how a benevolent nation um, operates. This is not the uh, the behavior, the behavioral pattern of benevolent nation. Now, if you have any questions about that, you can say, okay, let's apply this to humans. Okay. If someone acted like that and say, I want that piece of land, and because I'm stronger and I have whatever more money and I have a little army on my land here and I will go take it by force if one way or another I will get it. So, it's like we'd be like, man, that's a that's not a good person. Okay. That's just not a good person. We would say that. And this reminds me of the interview that Dr. Ron Paul recently did with Tucker Carlson. Dr. Ron Paul was like the gateway for me into paleoconservative, constitutional style politics. Up until then, I was, I guess, what you call kind of like a run of the mill conservative, a Republican. I believed uh, all the garbage that neocons believe. It never occurred to me that a lot of the government agencies that, for instance, they were debating on in 2008 and 2012 shouldn't exist. They would ask questions in those debates. I remember where, would it be monetary issues, environmental issues, and things like that. And so the questions and the debates would start going around these agencies. How should they operate? How much funding should they be? How much should we take back? And whatever. It's like, what should their powers be? What should they not be? And Ron Paul, he always gave like this answer that seemed to come out of left field because his answer was basically he always destroyed the assumption on which the question was based. When it came to the EPA, he said the EPA has no constitutional authority to exist, whereas everyone else was basically debating what kind of permissions it should and should not have, whereas Ron Paul was like, it shouldn't exist. When it talked about economic policy, and of course, this is where Ron Paul really shines, they were saying, he came out and he said, look, we have a Federal Reserve bank that is pseudo private and it creates money out of thin air and it should not exist. It should not have this kind of power. This is not constitutional. Over and over, he did this. And so we, during that interview, he said that his basis of operation, when he looks at something, because he's really non-interventionist, and I really appreciate that. He's one of, like I said, one of my main influencers. But he said, here in America, we have a rule of law that unless you're super, super elite or whatever, it kind of applies more or less. Don't lie, cheat, steal. I guess lying is not, but he says, nevertheless, we have these moral and, and statutory laws that come toward, that have these main prescriptions, right? Don't lie, cheat, steal, or kill. And that's generally accepted, right? By the American people, by decent people all over the world. It's like, yeah, that's okay. But he says, then, but we don't apply that to our government. And our government does that. It lies, it cheats, and steals and kills. And and that's been happening for a long time. And we find out, and they'll justify it and whatnot, but it's like, it's really insane that we allow that, that we think it's okay because it's the government to do that. And then they'll say, well, they'll come in with some excuse about why we need to be there. For instance, the Middle East, which I've heard again from some of my veteran friends and whatnot. It's like, when we were in that Iraq or whatever, they were, the Iran was, pretty bellicose or whatever. And I'm like, do you ever stop to think that we shouldn't have been there? How would we react if Iran or Russia or China started putting little installations in Canada, all over Canada and Mexico and Cuba, as the Russians did and whatnot, and they just got us, and they start poking their nose into our foreign policy, into our domestic policy and whatnot? Like, we wouldn't be cool with that, right? Is it possible that maybe we wouldn't have so many freaking enemies in the Middle East if we weren't all over the place? No one asked for the United States to be the global police. The only people who think this is a good idea are the international elites, the people who make these decisions independent of the American people who pay for it, who die across, who die in these wars and in these operations. But the American people never got a say. They never got a say. They just started putting, after World War II, they just started putting installations everywhere, bases everywhere. The CIA started overthrowing governments everywhere, getting in everyone's business and whatnot, over and over. And some of them, based on what I've learned, is like, you can argue, it's like, well, that was a good one. That came out good. It's like, I'm glad that, we knocked off that guy or that, because some of these people are genuinely bad. I get it. I get it. I get it. I don't think we're in that situation right now. I'm not saying the Iranians are good, but I think we have to consider the fact that we live in a complex world where every power nation has its sphere of influence. This is the way things have more or less been. And this was the way the founding fathers thought. They're like, look, we're not going to meddle in Europe's business. They said Europe has a tendency to get very dramatic. There's a lot of things that come out of Europe and whatnot. It's like, let's stay away from that. Now, when it comes to the Western Hemisphere, we'll have somewhat of a different look, hence the Monroe Doctrine. But they were like, when it comes to Europe, when it's anything out of our hemisphere, they say, no, 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 we're not dealing with that. And the idea was that basically, if we mind our own business, no one is, and we take care of our own, we're going to develop into a very strong nation, which it did. And no one's going to want to mess with us. And this is what Lincoln said, his famous saying about how there's not going to be one nation, that no single nation can come in here and, he said, take a lap from the Ohio River or whatever. He was basically saying no one will ever have the power to conquer us from the outside. And then he said the only way we can fall is from inside, which is what's happening. We don't need to be in Iran. We don't need to be in the Middle East. We don't need to be involved in Ukraine, and we don't need to be in Asia and whatnot. And that doesn't expose us to harm. Now, if you read the documents, the strategies from the US government recently posted, the way they look at it is they look at it through an economic filter. So this is how they justify all this intervention, basically that if things get out of hand or various markets close themselves or whatever, it's going to harm the economy here and the market here. I'm tired of hearing about that. I'm really tired of hearing that about that, and I'm sure some of that is true, but we can't prioritize, we can't look at everything through this filter of of the, you know, of consumerism, okay? That's that cannot be our priority. I don't understand how we can survive if our main lens, our main value comes down to money. You're not going to survive if that's the case. We're not going to survive as a nation regardless if that's the case. We have to stick to our own hemisphere. We have lots of problems at home, but moreover, a lot of the reasons we have enemies in these other areas where we say, well, you know, they killed American soldiers in the 80s and they killed, you know, their proxies. It's like, yeah, because we were stupid enough to put them there. I'm sorry. I'm not making light of the fact that we lost lives, that we lost Marines, you know, and what we lost. I'm actually quite the opposite. I'm pretty ticked off about the fact that we put people in harm's way. Okay. And we did it because we are the muscle for the emerging global order. You have to understand this, people. This isn't about American interest. It's quite the opposite. It's about international interest. This does not serve our interests. We have lots of oil here, and we have lots of agreements with Middle Eastern countries and whatnot. Like there's all sorts of ways that we could work around this that does not require us to be spread all over the world like an empire, because that's what it is. We are an empire. You have to come to terms with this. And I don't know about you, but I'm not cool with it. And I don't think the American people are generally cool with it because no, they never asked us. All this happened without them asking us. So going back to Iran, they want Iran to basically not have any nuclear capabilities on their in their country. You know, they're looking for maybe like somewhere, some sort of neutral territory uh, where inspectors can look and whatnot. Again, I get it, I hear that, but what does that say that we get to that makes us the arbiters? Like we get to decide. Obviously, the only reason we get to decide is because might makes right. That's our approach here. And again, if that were a person, if we knew someone like that who made decisions, who imposed his will on others, his friends included, or whatever, because he can, because he's stronger, we call that a bully. And that's generally not a person that is held in high regard. Well, that's us. That's us. That's what's happening right now. It's might makes right. That's the, you know, some will say, well, that's the way the world works. Yes, I agree, and I think to some degree that'll always somewhat be the case. But to basically to just flaunt it um, is reflects a rot. It reflects a moral shortcoming in our nation. And you know, if Iran wants to have nuclear power, and I think they should. I don't necessarily. I'm not sure if I think they should have a nuclear weapon. You know, but nuclear power, they should certainly be able to have nuclear power. It's very efficient. I'm a big proponent of it. And, you know, it lifts people out of poverty and whatnot. They should be able to have that. Another thing, apparently, we don't want them to have is basically ballistic missiles. We want to restrict their capabilities on ballistic missiles to the point where it's not worth having them. Um, we would never accept those kind of terms. Israel would never accept those kind of terms. Russia would no sane country would accept those terms, but we want them to. And considering that they're surrounded by enemies, we're over there, you know, Israel's over there. Israel just attacked them or whatever. We're about to attack them and whatnot. It's like, how much sense does that make? Like, yeah, why don't you become a sitting duck even more? Those are the things we're asking them. So we're basically setting up um, this negotiation for them to basically say no. We're setting it up in a way where they just can't say yes. There's no way they can agree to this. We're making it look like we gave it a try, but we didn't. We didn't. So why do we keep allowing this? I think a lot of people, I think the main thing is people in general, Americans, they think we're still the good guys. And we're not. I don't think we are. But I have a massive caveat here because I thought about this a lot. And I love the United States. Uh, my family came here when we were little from communist Romania. We have had a good life. We continue to have a good life, a kind of life that I don't think you can have anywhere else. So I want to put that out there. Okay. I'm probably more patriotic than anyone, than most people. I've gone to great lengths to understand the founding fathers' mission and agenda for this country. I have come to really value and respect the system of governance that they put in motion. And it's what those are the reasons that anger me or trigger me even more because one, we're not following those. We are not following the guidelines and even the Constitution. We are not. We're basically taking the country, the government as a whole. We're taking a massive dump on the system that they put into motion. It's unrecognizable from what it was. And, as far as being a patriot, I think it's far more patriotic to call out when the government has gone rogue. I don't think the government reflects the character of the people of America. I've lived in 4 states, and we used to travel more than we do now. We're kind of over the last year or whatever, ever since we moved here, we've kind of hunkered down a little bit, and our lifestyle has changed and whatnot. But our family uh, since ever since I met Teresa, we used to spend a lot of time traveling, and like I said, we've lived in 3 states together. I've lived in 4 states. I grew up in the South. I lived in the West for years. Then I lived in the Midwest, and now I live in the what's called the Upland South. And in between all that, we've traveled to most states. I think the only region I haven't spent any time in is New England. Okay. All that to say is that I've met a lot of people everywhere and Americans. And I love Americans. I consider myself an American. And I don't think that the character of the people that I've met is reflected by our government. I do not think that. I think the people in power are um, are a few things. I think a lot of them are verified sociopaths. This is there's clinical studies showing. I think there's like 4% of people are sociopaths, and they gravitate towards positions of power. Okay, that's why you're seeing um, you're seeing things that don't necessarily make sense. For instance, like Lindsey Graham. This guy's always calling for war. Once he said at a conference somewhere that Trump is doing a great job. He says, we're lowering taxes and we're killing the right people. Who says that? A sociopath. This man he has supported every single freaking war. That's all he does. And so he's grade A example of a sociopath. So we have to take into consideration, and I'm not even talking about just the people that we're seeing. There's likely the real powers is held within the what's called the deep state. This network of first of all, on the government side, it's bureaucrats, kind of bureaucrats, but also people in higher positions in various agencies. The people who've been there forever, they're very entrenched. And so, for instance, when Bongino and Cash Patel went to the FBI. Before they went there, they talked very different. They were different persons. All of a sudden, they got there, and all of a sudden, you're hearing there's no more nothing to the Epstein files, and then of course we pursue that, and it ends up there's a whole lot more and whatever. But everyone's wondering like, what happened to them? What happened is they got taken in by the dark side. These these agencies are, my understanding is the people in charge over here, the ones with the power, and not just the FBI and the CIA and these various agencies, um, they they're insurmountable in some way, and they don't reflect. They're their own government. It's kind of like a shadow government. They're the ones that have more power over the agencies and generally even over the foreign policy and the government and whatnot. There's lots of moving parts here. We saw with the Epstein files that there's this international network of very powerful people, and they're kind of way above in the sense like they're out there and they're talking. They're they're in finance, they're in academia, they're of course talking to heads of state, and so this is a power network. And these are the people who are pulling the strings. These are the people who are influencing the policies. These are the people who are influencing the culture through the academia and whatnot. And they're not like me and you. They're not like regular Americans. They're not like anyone here on my road where I live in rural Kentucky. I can tell you that for sure. Just like they're not like anyone in my other neighborhoods when I lived in Wisconsin or Montana or even in metro Atlanta and whatnot. These people are not like us, but they represent us around the world and they make these decisions and they push these decisions on us. Isn't it crazy that one man gets to decide that he's going to, whether or not we're going to hit Iran? That's what we're waiting for right now. Look at the news headlines. The news headlines are filled with some version of, you know, Trump is ready to go. It's just a matter of when he's going to do it. That's not the way this was drawn up. That's not the way that the founding fathers drew this up. They, in fact, in the Federalists, they outline that this is not the president's position of the United States is not like that of the king. There are some similarities, they said, but there's great contrast there. And the big takeaway was that the king, the president, does not have power like the king to unilaterally declare war. They make it very plain, very blatant that that's the case. So I think a true patriot would point that out because it's important that we hold our people accountable, the people who have squirmed and slithered and connived and conned their way to power, because that's the kind of people that gravitate towards that. Meanwhile, the rest of us, we're not that interested in it because we're not sociopaths. We're not crazy because we're not insecure, because we're not as messed up as they are. I think for the most part, that doesn't mean that there aren't some who are over there doing good. As most of you know, one of my favorite is Thomas Massey, and for good reason. I think he's amazing. I think he's probably one of the few people who aren't sociopaths, one of the few people who actually lives up to the title of public servant. But I don't. I think most of them aren't necessarily like that. I'm not saying that they're all sociopaths or even most of them. The others, I think they're kind of cowards. They're cowards. They sit there and they follow the edicts of the president, and they don't want to buck the system. They don't want to disagree because they're afraid that they'll get yelled at. They're afraid that he's going to rattle off some tweet or some Truth Social post about how stupid or whatever, one of his stupid juvenile, idiotic rants and whatnot, and then they'll have to, they'll be the target of it. These aren't serious people. The guy who's rattling off the tweet's not a serious person, and neither is the person who's too afraid to stand up for what is right. What they're doing is not for the reasons that they're telling you they're doing it. I don't believe it. I think there's a bigger play here with Iran, and it has very little to do with freeing the Iranian people. And by the way, I'll leave off with this. Maybe the last time the U.S. government, officials within the U.S. government and of operations intervened to to overthrow the Iranian government was 1979 when they overthrew the Shah. The regime that is in power right now is in power because the United States wanted the last guys in and empowered this regime. So keep that in mind. This isn't what they're portraying it to be. It's not it's not moral, and it doesn't live up to the promises of the Trump campaign. We have to start thinking differently. We have to start coming to the realization that there just might be a chance that we are the bad guys, that we are behaving like the bad guys. If the shoe were on the other foot, I think it'd be easier to see that. Doesn't make the other people angels. Doesn't make the Ayatollah an angel. It doesn't make Putin a good guy or whatever. That's not, but we're not behaving any better. The only reason it's hard to see that is because our side, our elites, have up until recently, they've been a little more sophisticated. It's a different kind of tyranny. It's a different kind of propaganda. It's a lot more sophisticated. The manipulation is more refined. They used, consumerism. They use propaganda. They use these techniques that are very refined to put us under a spell, to take control of all the avenues of communication, not just the news media and entertainment, but academia. So we're living in a sort of matrix. What you see and what you're told is almost always a lie, or there's some element of a lie to it. And the freedom that we have, which I very much respect and I love, and I'm not going to pretend that we don't have freedom that the Iranians, and I'm not going to pretend that it's not awesome because it is. But keep in mind that it has a ceiling. And that ceiling, that restriction is way lower than where it should be. They want us to think that we have more choice than we have. But when it comes to the big issues, we don't have that choice. You're not as free as you think that you are. You're just not. None of us are. It doesn't mean we're not freer than the Iranians, the Russians, the Chinese, or whatever. I'm not arguing that. But that's not the bar. We need to stop thinking like, well, let's compare ourselves to, no, let's compare ourselves to the bar. Let's compare ourselves to the system. Let's compare the system that we inherited, that the founding generation died for. Let's compare it to that. And that's not the system that we have. You have some choice here and there, but once it conflicts with the interest of the international cabal, of the deep state and whatnot, then you start to see things go real wonky. Then you start to see that our requests, our desires, our views are not reflected. Again, not a single American ever voted to build an American empire, to put a base everywhere, all over the world, to intervene in all these instances. It's like right now there's a lot of pushback over this Iran thing, and for good reasons, because we didn't vote for that, but they're going to do it anyway. Why? Because they're trampling all over the way that this is supposed to work. The way it's supposed to work is if you don't have the one man in the White House who gets to say when we go to war, that's Congress. That's the way it's supposed to work, because Congress represents the people. Okay? So that's just one example, with the Federal Reserve, with the way that was put through and the way that they've taken control of the money. We didn't get a vote on that. We did not. Obviously, the Federal Reserve came through an act of Congress. But I don't think there's anyone who voted to live under a fiat system where a bank gets to basically print money out of thin air, dilute our money in the process, and makes everyone on top rich and richer while us poorer. No one voted for that. No one voted to be $38 trillion in debt, and they keep doing it. They keep doing it. There's like Republicans, one of the main concern of Republicans was the debt. And yet there's been no change in the debt. They have no intention of doing that. Remember when Speaker Johnson didn't have enough Republican votes to pass one of those continuing resolutions? And so he ended up getting through because he had more Democrat votes. That tells you where this is. The people are not represented when it comes to the big things, when it comes to uh, to to economic policies, when it comes to uh, foreign policy, and up until Trump, which I will give him credit, on migration, mass migration. It didn't matter who was in, they just kept coming in. It didn't matter that the constituents of the Republicans have forever said, we can't keep having these people in. Again, actually, Trump has done a good job on this. And I think this is one of the few things he's done a good job on. I think the other things he's done a good job in is he's trampled all over the green con, which it deserves it. And then a lot of the cultural issues. That was BS. So, anyway, I've ranted enough. See you next time.